Welcome to Sherlock Mysteries, where every case takes you deeper into suspense, secrets, and thrilling investigations inspired by the world of detectives. If you love solving puzzles and uncovering hidden truths, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments which part of the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Now, let's start the story. The affair first came to our attention on a wet October morning, but neither Holmes nor I could have predicted the labyrinthine depth of the puzzle that lay ahead. The fire crackled in our Baker Street sitting room, casting errant flickers of gold across Holmes's angular profile as he reclined with eyes closed and long fingers steepled beneath his chin. Outside, the fog rolled in thick waves down the cobblestone street, reducing the city to a dull hum, interrupted only by the clatter of carriage wheels and the call of a newspaper boy announcing a scandal in Parliament. I had just put down the Times, having read yet another dreary political column, when a sharp rap came at the door. Before Mrs. Hudson could react, Holmes's voice called out, "Come in, Inspector. You're 23 minutes earlier than I expected." Lestrade entered with his usual determination, doffing his bowler and stamping the water from his boots. "You are not mistaken about the time, Holmes. The train was quick this morning. But I've come for business. Nasty one." Holmes opened one eye, pointed to the hearth, and motioned for me to take notes. Lestrade drew a folded envelope from his coat pocket, but it was the photograph clipped inside that caught my attention first. "I've seen murders," Lestrade said grimly, "but this one is different. Man named Percival Sutcliffe is a retired banker. Lived alone in a townhouse in Marylebone. Found dead in his study yesterday morning. Single bullet through the chest, door locked from the inside. No signs of a struggle." Holmes remained silent, but his gaze sharpened. "Now, ordinarily I'd think suicide," Lestrade went on, "but the angle of the wound's wrong. Ballistics say it came from the front, low and to the left. And here's the strange bit. A photographer, freelance, name of Arnold Bellamy, says he was hired to take Sutcliffe's portrait for a vanity commission. Claims he arrived at 10:30, knocked and got no answer. He waited, then heard a sound like a shot. Police were called. They broke in through the French doors from the garden." Holmes finally reached for the envelope. "And this photograph?" Lestrade nodded. "Bellamy swears he took it yesterday. Says Sutcliffe insisted on a dry-run test shot just before the real sitting. But here's the catch. Look closely at Sutcliffe's waistcoat." I leaned in with Holmes as he studied the print. It showed a distinguished gentleman seated in a leather-backed chair, one hand on a walking stick, the other resting on the arm. At first glance, nothing appeared amiss. Then Holmes frowned, tilted his head, and tapped the image with a long forefinger. "Ah," he murmured. "So that's your trouble. What is it?" I inquired. Holmes handed me the photograph. "Dr. Watson, you have an eye for detail, though not always the most observant one. Do you see the watch chain?" I looked again. Indeed, a gold chain crossed the man's chest, tucked into his waistcoat pocket, but it was unfastened at one end, dangling rather awkwardly, as if broken or never clipped properly. "Exactly," Holmes said. "A man of Sutcliffe's generation and profession would never have tolerated such disorder in a formal portrait. The chain is not simply dislodged, it is cut, and yet Bellamy insists this was taken before Sutcliffe was found dead." Lestrade nodded grimly. "That's not the only issue. The sitting room was immaculate, except for one thing. A cracked photograph frame on the fireplace mantel. Broken glass and the photo inside missing. And what did it contain?" Holmes asked. Bellamy couldn't say. But the housekeeper, an old woman named Mrs. Rance, says it was of Sutcliffe and a young woman. His niece, I believe. Recently engaged to a man Sutcliffe disapproved of. Holmes stood then, moving to the window with a sudden energy. "Tell me, Lestrade, has the camera been examined?" "Bellamy still has it. It's a bulky German make, takes plates rather than film. No other exposures on it except this one." Holmes turned back with that peculiar gleam I had learned to dread and admire in equal measure. "You will of course allow me to speak with Mr. Bellamy, but first we must visit Marylebone. There's something wrong with that room, something missing. The photograph, the chain, the position of the body. No, Lestrade, this is not a simple case. Someone has killed a man and tried to make truth lie within an image." His eyes glittered. "And that, gentleman, goes where they made their mistake." The fog had thickened by the time our hansom cab clattered its way through Marylebone. curling in ghostly ribbons between the gas lamps and clinging to the eaves of townhouses like some silent witness. Holmes sat forward, fingers laced beneath his chin, his gaze fixed on a point only he could see. I recognized the expression well. He was not idle. He was arranging, turning over the evidence in that cavernous mind of his and placing it into a logic no one else could yet. Say the Sutcliffe property was situated on a modest crescent of brick facades and wrought iron gates, flanked on either side by quiet, respectable neighbours. Most residences had their curtains shut against the dreary weather, but the late Mr. Sutcliffe's had a small light in the drawing-room window and a police constable stationed firmly at the door. Lestrade was already ahead of us, flashing his credentials and exchanging brief words with the constable. Holmes barely acknowledged either man as we walked into the house, his boots silent on the thick carpeting. The air inside smelled faintly of pipe smoke and floor polish, with a colder undertone, an emptiness that clung to the walls like dust. Mrs. Rance, the housekeeper, was a pinched woman of advanced years, with dubious eyes who hovered in the corridor wringing her hands. "If you'll kindly take us to the study," Holmes replied, hardly looking at her, "and see that we are not disturbed." The study was a gentleman's retreat, with dark oak panels, a well-stocked bookshelves, a heavy mahogany desk, and a faded leather chair tilted slightly toward the fireplace. Nothing was destroyed or ransacked. The room showed no evidence of panic or violence, except for the noticeably vacant place on the mantel where the missing image had formerly stood. Holmes went about the room like a man deciphering a secret code, his fingertips skimming the air as he watched. He lingered before the fireplace, crouching slightly to examine the marble surround. He lifted a little piece of glass from the floor with tweezers, held it up to the light, and then slipped it into his coat. "Watson," he called, motioning for me to join him. "You recall Lestrade's mention of the French doors?" "Yes, the police entered through them after the photographer reported hearing the shot." "Indeed. Take note of the carpet here." He pointed to a thick Aubusson rug that reached almost to the entrance. "It's been straightened. See here, the indentations are not aligned. Something substantial was relocated, possibly after the shot was taken." He brushed the dust from his knees and turned to face the enormous recliner. "This is where Sutcliffe was sitting when the photograph was taken," he remarked softly. "But the photograph was not captured at the moment Bellamy claims." "How can you be certain?" "Because Sutcliffe is dead in it." I blinked at him. "Holmes, you can't mean—" "I do." The slackness of the left hand, the pallor beneath the eyes, and most tellingly, the unnatural stiffness of his posture. A living guy does not sit so rigidly unless he is actively performing, and a conceited man, as Lestrade described Sutcliffe, would not endure such an ugly similarity. The photograph was staged. Not to record life, but to present it. Lestrade returned before I could respond with a knock on the door. "I've sent for Bellamy," the inspector declared. "Should be arriving soon. But I thought you'd like this." He gave Holmes a folded sheet of paper. I discovered it in the desk drawer, under a false bottom. I suppose it was written in Sutcliffe's hand. Holmes examined it rapidly, his face deepening. It was a brief but strong letter addressed to Edwin Hartridge, dated 2 days prior. It warned Hartridge to avoid her, to abandon the fantasy of an elopement, and concluded with the words, "This ends now, or I will end it for you." "Who is Hartridge?" I asked. "Sutcliffe's niece's fiancé," Lestrade explained grimly. Evidently not well favoured by the old man. Holmes remained silent for a moment. "Tell me, Lestrade, did the coroner note time of death?" "Around 10:30, give or take 15 minutes. And Bellamy claims to have arrived at exactly that time." "Yes." "Curious," Holmes said, more to himself than to us. "Then either Bellamy was the last to see him alive, or the first to see him dead." We did not wait long before the photographer himself was shown in. Arnold Bellamy was a lean man in his early 40s, with a neatly trimmed beard, and the slightly dishevelled look of an artist who'd attempted respectability for the sake of appearance. His camera case, a large leather-bound satchel, hung from one shoulder. "I trust this won't take long," he said, eyes darting between us. "I've told the police everything I know." "I believe you've told them something, Mr. Bellamy," Holmes said coolly. "Whether it was the truth remains to be seen. Please, describe exactly what occurred yesterday." Bellamy exhaled and glanced around the room. "I was hired through an intermediary, never met Mr. Sutcliffe until yesterday. He contacted me by letter to arrange a portrait, said it was to commemorate his retirement. I arrived at 10:30 sharp. Knocked, no reply. I waited 5 minutes, then heard what sounded like a pop or muffled bang from inside. Thought it might be a gun, so I went to the back and found the garden gate open. Called the police and they forced entry. Holmes studied him. And the photograph? Bellamy paused. It was taken earlier. A test shot. Sutcliffe insisted. And yet that same man now lies dead in the photograph you provided. I beg your pardon. Bellamy blinked, startled. Holmes walked slowly towards him, holding out the print. The man in this photograph has died. You can either acknowledge that the photograph was taken after death, or provide evidence to the magistrate. Your choice, Mr. Bellamy. Bellamy paled visibly. I didn't kill him. I never said you did, Holmes responded sharply. But you've been used. The camera, the timing, all were part of a performance. The question is, who directed it? Bellamy swallowed. I was paid at double my usual rate. The note advised not to ask questions. I found it strange, but you complied, Holmes finished for him. Did you take any other photographs? Bellamy shook his head. Just that one. Holmes turned to Lestrade. Have his plates seized and developed? All of them. And bring in the niece. We must speak with Miss Evelyn Sutcliffe. He paused as he reached the doorway, glancing back toward the empty mantel. The photograph that was stolen holds the emotional key to this case. The image Bellamy captured was the physical lie. But it is the missing image, the one removed, that tells us who feared the truth, and with that, Holmes swept from the study into the fog once more, leaving only the faint scent of tobacco and suspicion in his wake. We found Miss Evelyn Sutcliffe at the home of a family friend in Chelsea, a modest brick townhouse shaded by elms and ivy. It was Lestrade who made the official request for her presence, though Holmes insisted we accompany her return journey in the same cab to Baker Street. She was a woman of perhaps 24, with a bearing at once refined and quietly anxious. Her morning dress was already in place, though the edges of the hem looked newly stitched, hastily prepared. Her gloved hands clutched a folded handkerchief, and though her eyes were not red from tears, they held a watchful wariness that Holmes did not overlook. You knew Mr. Bellamy, I presume? Holmes asked as the cab rattled over the cobbles. I met him once, she said. He came to take Uncle's photograph the morning he... She faltered, glanced away, then added, I wasn't present. Yet you were living in the same house? No. Uncle Percival sent me to stay with Mrs. Littleton 3 days ago. She met Holmes's eyes. It was not my idea. Was this related to your engagement? Yes, she said, her voice tightening. He didn't approve. Edwin and I had plans to marry quietly in the spring. Uncle said he would cut me off entirely if I did. Holmes folded his hands. Why did he disapprove? She hesitated, then said, He believed Edwin wanted me for my inheritance. He'd taken it upon himself to manage my affairs since my parents died. I never asked him to, Lestrade interjected. What do you know of this letter we found in your uncle's desk, threatening Mr. Hartridge to break off the engagement or face consequences? Evelyn's eyes narrowed. I hadn't seen it, but it sounds like him. Uncle thought control was a form of love. Did you love Mr. Hartridge? Holmes asked. There was a pause, barely perceptible, but it was there. I did, she said, almost too quickly. I do. Holmes said nothing more for the remainder of the journey, but I could see his mind working behind the silence like a windmill spinning through a gale. Back at Baker Street, Holmes seated Evelyn in the armchair opposite the hearth, while Mrs. Hudson brought in tea. Lestrade, for his part, remained by the window, arms crossed, eyeing Evelyn with the look of a man who saw a possible suspect in every gentle reply. I sat at my usual place near Holmes, my pen idle on the edge of the notebook. Miss Sutcliffe, Holmes began gently, you understand, of course, that we are not seeking to distress you, but certain inconsistencies have surfaced in the narrative surrounding your uncle's death. Chief among them, the photograph taken by Mr. Bellamy. You've seen it? She nodded faintly. The inspector showed me. And yet the photograph on the mantel was missing, Holmes continued. Mrs. Rance, your housekeeper, said it was of you and your uncle. It was. Can you describe it for me? Her fingers tightened on her handkerchief. It was taken when I turned 21. Uncle insisted on marking it with a formal portrait. We were standing in the conservatory, he in his favorite blue waistcoat and me in a dress he had purchased in Paris. Would you say the expression on his face was affectionate? She blinked, taken off guard. Yes, he smiled. I don't think he smiled often in images. And who removed it from the mantel? I don't know. Try to remember if anything had changed in the photograph recently. Was it always on display? Yes, until 2 days ago. I noticed the frame was crooked, and then it disappeared entirely. Holmes rose and turned toward the fire. Then we are dealing with a lie that was not merely captured, but arranged. He turned back to face her. Did your fiancé ever visit the house in your uncle's absence? Once or twice, to deliver letters, flowers, but never stayed long? No, Uncle banned it. Holmes paced towards the window. And if your uncle were to discover something incriminating in Mr. Hartridge's past, a motive for him to keep you apart, how would you have reacted? Her voice lowered. That would depend on what he discovered. Holmes smiled faintly, though it held no amusement. What if I told you that the real issue here may not have been your uncle's opposition, but something your uncle learned, something he may have seen just before he died? She looked up. What do you mean? But Holmes did not answer. Instead, he crossed to the mantel, where a sheaf of photographic negatives now lay in an envelope, brought in earlier that morning by a constable following our search of Bellamy's studio. He pulled one free and held it to the window light. Ah, what is it? I asked. He handed the negative to me. A second photograph, Watson. Taken with the same lens, but the subject is different. I studied the negative. The exposure showed Sutcliffe once more, seated in the same armchair, but not alone. A second figure stood behind him, partially obscured by shadow. I couldn't make out the face with certainty, but the height, the stance, and the outline of the lapel suggested a man. Young, upright. Hartridge? I asked. Holmes nodded. A fair assumption. This plate was not developed, and for good reason. It contradicts Bellamy's story. This photograph was taken before the fatal one. And therein lies our clue. Lestrade came forward. You think Hartridge was there? I do. And I think Sutcliffe found out something he was not meant to. Something Hartridge wanted hidden. So the first photograph was never meant to be seen, and the second, the one of a dead man, was staged to imply the old banker died alone. Evelyn had gone pale. You're saying Edwin lied? I'm saying, Holmes replied quietly, that someone went to great lengths to control what was seen, to curate the truth, as it were, through a lens. That is the peculiar power of photography. It captures not only what is, but what someone once remembered. He walked over to the desk and retrieved the cracked sliver of glass from his pocket. The broken frame confirms it. Someone destroyed the original image not out of grief but to erase context. Just then, a knock sounded at the door. Lestrade moved quickly to open it, revealing a tall, well-dressed man in a grey overcoat and gloves, Edwin Hartridge himself. He looked between the faces in the room, his own unreadable. I came as soon as I heard, he said softly. Evelyn, are you all right? She nodded, though her eyes had gone distant. Holmes said nothing at first. He slowly crossed to Hartridge and extended a hand. Hi, Mr. Hartridge. Did you ever sit for a photograph with Mr. Sutcliffe? Hartridge frowned. No. Why should I? Holmes turned to Lestrade. You will find fingerprints on the undeveloped plate. I assume Scotland Yard still has the necessary powders and brushes? Lestrade nodded grimly. Then I suggest we take Mr. Hartridge in for a formal statement. Hartridge stiffened. On what grounds? Holmes gave him a wire-thin smile. On the grounds, sir, that you forgot one crucial thing about a lie captured on film. It cannot change its mind. Edwin Hartridge did not resist arrest. That in itself was telling. He stood rigid and composed, as Lestrade informed him of the need for a formal statement and the possibility of a charge pending further evidence. Evelyn rose as if to speak, but Holmes, with a quiet glance, urged her to remain seated. She obeyed, though her eyes followed. Hartridge to the door with a strange detachment, less the sorrow of a fiancé than the strained curiosity of a woman watching something unspoken unfold. Once the door closed behind Lestrade and Hartridge, Holmes resumed pacing, the fingers of his right hand rhythmically tapping his left wrist. I recognized the gesture. It meant the pieces were forming, but the outline of the puzzle had not yet declared itself. You see it, Watson? He said suddenly, turning to me. I see a photograph that was never meant to exist, I replied, and a second man trying too hard to pretend he was never in the frame. Holmes grinned slightly. Quite right. But the question, my dear fellow, is not merely what Hartridge was doing in the house, it is when. He crossed to the mantel once again and retrieved the two photographic prints, the staged portrait of the deceased Mr. Sutcliffe and the undeveloped negative that featured Hartridge behind him. He laid both on the table side by side. In the photograph with Hartridge, Sutcliffe appears relaxed, at ease. Compare that to the corpse-like rigidity in the so-called test shot. There is no muscle tone in the limbs, no tension in the fingers. Dead men do not pose. But what if Hartridge did not come to kill? I stared at him. You believe Hartridge came for something else, an appeal perhaps? A final conversation? Perhaps, Holmes murmured. But I believe it is more complex than that. He turned suddenly. Evelyn, one more question if I may. She blinked. Yes? What would happen to your inheritance if your uncle died without altering his will? She hesitated but answered, It would revert to me. The last draft I saw left everything to me, even though he disapproved of my engagement. Ah, Holmes said quietly, but you assume that draft remained untouched. What if Sutcliffe intended to change it? What if that was the true reason Hartridge visited? Evelyn paled. You mean he went to stop the change? Holmes shakes his head. That is one possibility. But I believe we are missing the true orchestrator of this performance. He turned to the photograph again. This image did not create itself. It was planned, and someone wanted the world to believe that Sutcliffe died alone, that it was suicide or at least a crime without witness. Bellamy claims he took only one photograph, yet the negative proves otherwise. He lied. You think Bellamy is more involved than we realized? I asked. I'm now certain of it, Holmes said. We must pay him another visit, at once. By the time we reached Bellamy's modest studio on Fleet Street, dusk was thickening and the gaslights were flickering to life. Bellamy's establishment occupied the second floor above a print shop, the windows shuttered and faint lamplight seeping through a crack beneath the door. Holmes knocked and we heard movement within, a chair scraping hastily, then a bolt being drawn back. Bellamy opened the door, eyes wide. I've already given my statement to the police. And now you shall give one to me, Holmes said firmly, stepping inside without waiting for invitation. I have no doubt Lestrade will find your photographic plates quite illuminating. But you have one final chance to be truthful, sir. So I suggest you take it. Bellamy backed away as Holmes advanced, his presence at once calm and absolute. The studio was cramped and smelled of chemicals, sodium thiosulfate and old varnish. Shelves lined with glass plates and photographs framed in cheap brass filled the space, and on a side table sat the very camera we had seen described in Lestrade's notes. Holmes motioned to it. How many exposures did you take that morning? Bellamy opened his mouth to lie. Holmes raised a single finger. Think carefully. You're already involved in the staging of a body. The question is, were you a witness or an accomplice? Bellamy's shoulders sagged. 3. Go on. The first was from Sutcliffe and Hartridge. I was paid more to take it, but advised not to ask any questions. Then Hartridge exited the room. Mr. Sutcliffe remained behind, appearing troubled and agitated. He mentioned something about destroying a document. I was packed when I heard the gunshot. You did not run? I froze. It took mere seconds. Then someone else, someone I'd never seen, walked through the French doors from the garden. He was wrapped in a heavy coat and gloves. I couldn't see his face well. He looked straight at me and said, We'll need one more photograph. And I just did what I was instructed. Holmes's eyes glittered. Describe him. Tall, confident, young, perhaps 30. He spoke like a gentleman from Eton or Oxford. And you told no one. I got paid again, double again. I was informed that if I mentioned anything, the police would assume I faked it. And they would not be wrong. Holmes moved back, hands behind his back. So there was a third man. Someone with knowledge of Hartridge's visit, with access to the house and the boldness to manipulate the scene. He stopped, then turned to me. Watson, what do we know about the housekeeper, Mrs. Rance? Only that she had been with Sutcliffe for 20 years. She's the one who informed us of the lost photograph. And conveniently absent at the time of death, Holmes added with narrowed eyes. She claimed to be at market. But I found no sign of a purchased parcel, no receipts and no vegetables in the larder that had not been there the night before. Bellamy appeared stunned. You think she... I think, Holmes replied ominously, that she might not be who she claims. I suppose someone infiltrated that residence under the appearance of faithful service, and someone with knowledge of the house's layout, the study's locks, and Mr. Sutcliffe's routine planned the entry, shot, and cover-up. He straightened, then gave Bellamy one last look. You will go to Scotland Yard tonight and make your full confession to Inspector Lestrade. If you miss a single detail, I will ensure that your career ends in disgrace. Bellamy nodded quietly. Outside in the fog, Holmes walked quickly. It fits, Watson. The lie was more than just the photograph. It was the stillness of a meticulously organized household. Sutcliffe never expected betrayal from within. The man who entered following the gunfire was not an intruder. He was an insider, possibly a related, possibly an heir. Then Mrs. Rance, it is our next visit. But I don't think she'll greet us as herself. I believe we will find an empty chamber and a track that is already becoming chilly. He summoned a cab, and as it arrived with a clatter of hooves, he turned to me with a grim determination. We're not just after the murderer, Watson. We're looking for a playwright who has died. A man who believes a lie, once exposed to light, becomes truth. With that, we stepped into the cab, and the fog swallowed us again. When we returned to the Sutcliffe residence, Mrs. Rance's lodgings above the kitchen were dark. The constable stationed outside gave a small start when he saw Holmes descend quickly from the cab, his coat flaring like a raven's wing in the night air. She hasn't returned, the man said, adjusting his collar against the gathering mist. Went out just after noon, sir. She said she was visiting her sister in Kensington. Holmes said nothing as we walked inside. The house had an unnatural stillness about it now, as if some important presence had quietly withdrawn. Without hesitation, he ascended the back staircase to the servants' quarters, and I followed, the narrow steps creaking beneath us. The door to Mrs. Rance's room was unlocked. A single lamp sat cold on the nightstand, and the bed was overly neatly made. A quick inspection of the wardrobe revealed that her heavier coat and boots were missing, as were 2 travel trunks that had been present during our last visit. Holmes stood in the center of the room, surveying its barren cleanliness with narrowed eyes. She's gone, I said. Vanished. Holmes knelt by the bed, running his fingers lightly across the flooring. He used a penknife from his coat pocket to pry up a loose plank at the perimeter of the room. A small bundle of paperwork lay behind it, wrapped in a linen cloth. He unwrapped it with the care of someone handling a spider's web. Inside there were many letters, a birth certificate and an ancient daguerreotype. I moved closer as Holmes brought the shot up to the light. It depicted a younger Sutcliffe smiling awkwardly, his arm around a woman with striking features. A strong jaw, piercing brow, and intense dark eyes. In her arms was a boy no older than 10. Not Mrs. Rance, I replied. No, Holmes responded. Not in name. He rapidly thumbed over the letters, scanning. Her real name is Lydia Belham. The woman in the shot was Sutcliffe's sister, Isabel Belham. This boy Key would be her son. Then Mrs. Rance is the boy's grandmother. More likely his mother, Holmes said quietly, tapping the birth certificate. Lydia Belham, mother of Charles Percival Belham. Father is unknown. He looked up at me. She entered the household under a false name to stay close to her half-brother. 20 years of silent service, Watson. Not for duty, but for observation. But why? Holmes wrapped the papers and rose. Because the Sutcliffe fortune was supposed to pass to Evelyn. But if Lydia's son was Percival Sutcliffe's legal nephew, the will may be challenged. Perhaps she was hoping to locate a paper, a statement, or any remnant of former recognition. And when Sutcliffe started creating a new will, potentially excluding Evelyn from the inheritance entirely, she had to act quickly. But the killer was a man, I reminded him. Bellamy said so, Holmes nodded. Lydia Belham never worked alone. Watson, she orchestrated the environment, creating the illusion of domestic stability. But the hand that pulled the trigger was younger and faster. Her son is Charles, I frowned. Then where is he now? That, Holmes bitterly said, is the next question. By daylight, we'd established a name and a route. Scotland Yard had started putting together a dossier based on the identification Holmes provided. Charles Percival Belham, then 27, attended a grammar school in Sussex before disappearing from public records a decade ago. According to Lestrade, a man with the same name had arrived in London 3 weeks prior and had taken up residence under the alias Henry Malden, renting a studio flat in Bloomsbury. The landlord characterized him as quiet, polite, and never in long, a man with minimal luggage but superb tailoring. We arrived just as the landlady was heading out to get milk, her basket swinging at her hip. She looked at us suspiciously until Lestrade delivered his warrant. Holmes instructed her to unlock the room while the constable kept watch in the alley. The flat was nothing more than a sitting room and a cot, but what it contained said volumes. There was a heavy traveling coat folded over a chair, the identical cut and shape Bellamy described, and a small black case beneath it, which Holmes carefully opened with a penknife. Inside were letters, newspaper clippings, and a worn calling card with the name Arnold Bellamy, photographer of distinction. A note in an unfamiliar hand was written beneath it. He will be in the study at 10:30. Make it look like a disagreement. The photograph must depict calm, Lestrade swore beneath his breath. They had planned the entire thing. Bellamy lied about more than just the photograph. He was hired for it. No, Holmes corrected him. He was recruited. Perhaps they were blackmailed. But not the architect. I stepped to the window and stared out over London's rooftops, the city waking up beneath a mist of rain. Holmes, I added, this whole system was built not on money or legacy, but on pictures, a photo of someone posing to lie. A memory was wiped. A servant that was not a servant. Holmes slowly turned away from the case. Yes, and it was almost perfect. However, they miscalculated one thing. What? The camera sees what the mind ignores. Sutcliffe leans slightly to the left in the second photograph, which features Hartridge. However, in the final photograph, posed after death, his head is turned the opposite way. Rigor mortis could not have relocated him this accurately. Someone moved the corpse. He stepped away from the case and confronted Lestrade. We must find Lydia Belham. She may have fled or be waiting to see how the play ends. In any case, the final act is about to begin. The break happened sooner than intended. That evening, Lestrade returned to Baker Street with news. A woman who matched Lydia's description had booked passage on a boat going for Antwerp under the name Margaret Croft. She paid cash and boarded alone, but a telegraph from Dover verified she never arrived at the dock. Instead, a porter reported seeing a woman who matched her description board a private vehicle near Charing Cross an hour earlier, escorted by a tall man in a dark suit. Charles, I answered. Indeed, Holmes said. They are trying to vanish, but there's one place they can't escape. Where? The will. I just stared. You think there's a new will? I think Sutcliffe wrote one and concealed it. Perhaps in that very study. Perhaps not. But he sensed a betrayal coming. In his closing moments, he may have tried to protect Evelyn with a pen rather than a firearm. And if they knew, then they staged the scene to destroy all trace of it. Lestrade stood. We'll search the study again. Holmes raised a hand. There's no need. There is only one place it could be. We returned to the Sutcliffe home after midnight. The house was frigid but not disturbed. Holmes went straight to the fireplace, knelt by it, and started inspecting the grate. Here, he said quietly. Do you see, Watson? I leaned in. A big packet of paper was wedged just above the vent, folded and burnt but still whole. Holmes grabbed it with a pair of iron tongs. The will was dated 2 days before the murder. Percival Sutcliffe revoked all previous drafts and declared Evelyn his sole heir. An unsigned witness line appeared beneath his signature. He never had time to finish it, I muttered. No, Holmes replied, but he tried. And that, Watson, is what will haunt the real killers. They did not just take a life, they sought to accept the truth. Holmes finally took a deep breath despite the fact that the night was far from over. Outside, the fog started to lift. The half-burnt will was wrapped in an envelope and delivered to Lestrade by morning. The inspector, now completely disillusioned with the case's simplicity, promised to have it examined by the Yard's legal counsel and forensically preserved. But even before formal judgment could be rendered on the paper, Holmes was persuaded of its significance. He had gripped the charred edges between his fingers, as if they were the last echoes of the old man's last resistance, a desperate last stand against the creeping encroachment of betrayal. We returned to Baker Street that afternoon to collect our thoughts, and Holmes, always restless when the heart of a mystery remained unspoken, continued his pacing. The fog had cleared slightly, and carriages rattled more freely across the cobblestones. However, there was a heaviness in the air, as if London itself were waiting for the ultimate curtain to fall. The will alters everything, I continued, as I prepared 2 cups of tea, But it also implies that Charles Belham and his mother may have been unaware of it at all. If they had, they would have demolished it more entirely. Instead, they created a shot to represent seclusion. Why? Holmes paused mid-step. Because for them, the crime was about more than just inheritance. It was all about the narrative. A death without witnesses constitutes an act of silence. A fatality in the workplace, particularly in a conflict situation, raises questions. Questions invite investigation. But a guy dies alone in a confined chamber, leaving only conclusions. And Bellamy's photograph supplied the perfect illusion, I added. Holmes nodded. But illusion is only effective when no one discovers the seams. And Bellamy, poor devil, was never taught to weave corpses into stories. There was a knock on the door and Mrs. Hudson entered with a message. Holmes accepted it without remark, scanning the message quickly. I noticed his brow quiver, then remained still. It's from Dover, he explained. A man who fits Charles Belham's description has recently acquired passage on a commercial ship, the Adria. Departs evening for Calais. There is no sign of the woman yet. They're separating, I remarked. Possibly, Holmes said, or committing one final deception. We must leave. If Charles is running, he may still believe the lie is intact. But the moment the will is revealed publicly, he will flee beyond our grasp. Within an hour, we were on a fast train headed for Dover. Holmes sat beside me in the compartment, silent but vigilant. His half-lidded eyes moved between the window and his own reflection, as if he was looking for an unspoken truth. You've reached a conclusion, I remarked finally. He did not respond immediately. Then a soft yes, but I had been rejecting it. Why? Because it depicts something more than just criminal behavior. Watson, it's a drama of grief, a tragedy in which even the villain considers himself a hero. By the time we arrived in Dover, night had fallen. Lestrade had planned for 2 plainclothes officers to catch the Adria before boarding, but Holmes urged on a quiet approach, hoping to observe rather than frighten. The dock was wet with sea spray and lighted by lanterns. Men dragged packages while cursing and shouting in multiple languages. Holmes narrowed his eyes as he searched the crowd. There, he said softly, patting my arm. A man stood near the end of the line, collar lifted, his figure apparent. Charles stood erect and poised, watching the ship's movement with a weird, peaceful detachment. Holmes went quickly, but without haste. We arrived from the flank, and Charles didn't notice us until Holmes joined him. I'd hoped you'd run farther, Holmes replied lightly. Charles turned slowly. His gaze met Holmes without surprise. You found the will, he stated. Of course, Holmes responded. And now you're about to disappear. France, possibly. Then on to somewhere without photographs. No names, Charles exhaled. It would not matter. The truth always makes its way back, you believe that? I didn't, he said with a slight smile. Until I met your kind, Holmes inclined his head. Then explain why. Not the performance, the truth. Why did you return? Charles directed his sight to the lake. The wind blew lightly through his hair. Because he remembered me. I said nothing, detecting a shift in tone. Percival Sutcliffe, Charles said, was the man who abandoned my mother. He was the man who told her she had no relatives, no rights, and no inheritance. Years later, he summoned her, not to apologize, but to oversee. She became the silent maid in the house she was supposed to inherit. Growing up, I watched her iron his clothing, prepare his meals, watch Evelyn ride to school in a carriage while my mother does the dishes. So you killed him, I remarked calmly. He stared at me. No, Doctor. I did not come to kill him. I came to ask him to see me. Holmes stayed exactly still, and he did, Charles explained. That morning in the study, I told him who I was. I told him I didn't want anything. No money, there is no reparation. Just an acknowledgement. He looked at me for a long time. He then said, You are not the first mistake I've tried to forget. The quiet between us grew. I left, Charles replied, but I waited outside, and then I heard the gunshot. Holmes finally spoke. So it wasn't you? No, Charles said. It was her, my mother. I believe she was listening. I believe she watched him reject me again, and in that moment she transformed into someone else. He gazed back toward the Adria. She wasn't meant to kill. She was supposed to clean, but she cleaned everything, including the truth. Holmes stepped closer. Where is she now? Charles hesitated, then reached into his coat and handed Holmes a folded scrap of paper. An address, a name. No words were spoken. Lestrade and the constables arrived moments later. There was no struggle. Charles lifted his hands silently and calmly, allowing himself to be taken. As the lantern light faded behind us and the ship's horn reverberated across the harbor, Holmes and I stood looking out at the water, our breath in clouds before us. "You knew it wasn't him," I explained softly. Holmes shakes his head. "I suspected. But I feared the alternative. What will happen to him?" "He'll be charged as an accomplice," Holmes explained. "However, a good barrister could establish limited responsibility or ignorance. The true burden will fall on Lydia Bellam. And Evelyn?" Holmes was quiet for a moment. "Then she will inherit just as her uncle wanted, but she will now carry questions where assurance once existed." We turned away from the ocean, the wind blowing behind us. As we walked back to the waiting carriage, Holmes remarked to himself, "It is a terrible thing, Watson, when men begin to rewrite their past in ink, and others finish the correction in blood." We didn't wait till daylight. The location Charles had given, reluctantly but without protest, pointed to a tiny boarding house in Lambeth, nestled away down a narrow road where the gas lamps flashed like anxious sentries. The street was quiet, almost too quiet, and the windows of number 17 were dark when Holmes and I arrived by hired cab. The housekeeper, roused from her slumber and bribed with both charm and money, confirmed that the woman identifying herself as Margaret Croft had paid for a week's lodging in advance but had only returned once briefly since renting the room. Holmes ascended the steps like a man sinking into a solution. He paused on the second floor to listen, his head bent slightly to one side. No light poured from beneath the door. There is no creaking of floorboards. Still, he motioned for silence and withdrew his lockpick with ghost-like accuracy. The door opened with well-oiled hinges. The room was basic. A single bed, a writing desk, a wash basin, and a small case by the window. The air inside was thick with the aroma of lavender and the subtle tang of damp wool. Holmes stepped in first, his lantern cutting wide arcs across the walls. I followed, my eyes adjusting gradually. She was sitting in the far chair, her posture perfect. Her long, unpainted and solemn face was unsurprised when she saw Holmes. She'd been waiting. "You arrived sooner than I expected," Lydia Bellam said. Her voice was calm. Not defiant, but settled, as if she had accepted the timing, if not the content. Holmes tilted his head. "Charles told us." "I expected he might," she said. "He was always seeking closure." "I never did." He studied her a moment, then stepped fully inside. "You used Bellamy. You arranged the camera. You manipulated every detail of that morning, down to the cracked frame on the mantel. But you did not expect your son to give us your name." "No," she admitted. "I hoped he would vanish." "He deserves to. He was never meant to bear this." I approached slowly, heart pounding with the quiet awe of seeing a mystery embodied at last. "Why now? After 20 years, why strike then?" She turned her gaze toward me. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, did not flinch. "Because that house had become a mausoleum, Doctor. I lived every day with the knowledge that he, my half-brother, had erased me, denied me after everything. I scrubbed his teacups, sewed his linens, raised my son while pretending not to. I thought perhaps in time he would soften. But the older he grew, the more he clung to his illusions. He called Charles the result of indiscretion, a shadow. And Evelyn. She had his blessing, his name. I couldn't bear to watch her inherit it all while my son vanished from every page. You took the photograph of him and Charles," Holmes said. "And then the one after," she nodded. "I made Bellamy do it. I knew what kind of man he was, desperate, needing money. So I told him it was for legal purposes, that my employer was ill and I needed proof for a trust. He believed me. Until the shot. After that, I let him believe whatever kept him compliant. But Sutcliffe's death, I pressed. You shot him?" "No." She said it evenly. "He shot himself." The silence in the room swelled. Holmes stepped closer, lantern trembling slightly in his hand. "Explain." "He did not take rejection well," she said. He had dismissed Charles again, coldly. I watched from the corridor as my son left, trembling with restrained fury. Percival closed the door behind him and stood staring at the fireplace for nearly a minute. Then he opened his desk drawer, took out the pistol I knew he kept, and sat down. Her voice lowered. He saw me as I stepped into the doorway. He raised the pistol anyway. Perhaps he thought to shame me. Perhaps it was one final act of dominance. I don't know. He said only, "You never knew your place," and then he pulled the trigger. Holmes said nothing. Neither did I. I didn't scream, she continued. I didn't cry. I closed the door, waited 10 minutes, then went to fetch Bellamy. I told him Mr. Sutcliffe wanted one last sitting. No speaking, no questions. He did as he was told. I guided the scene. I corrected the tilt of the head. I folded the hands. I brushed the hair. You dressed a suicide, Holmes said quietly, to look like a murder without witness. Because a suicide would have complicated everything, she replied. It would raise questions about the will, about the estate, about Evelyn and Charles. But why not destroy the will entirely? She hesitated. I didn't find it. So you gambled, Holmes said. Yes, she admitted. I thought he may have left it unsigned, or that it had not been written at all. I'd watched him hesitate before, but I never saw him put it in the fireplace. Your son said he didn't know what you planned. She nodded. Because I didn't want him to carry it. I wanted him to believe it had been justice, not despair. Holmes set down the lantern on the desk. And what do you believe it was? She met his gaze evenly. It was his final performance. I only chose the lighting. Lestrade arrived shortly after, and Holmes handed him a full account in writing signed by Lydia herself. She made no protest as she was taken into custody. Only once as she passed the threshold did she glance back at the room, not regretfully, not mournfully, but like someone leaving behind the last act of a play. Outside, the fog had returned, blanketing the streets in familiar grey. We stood in the alley as the constables disappeared into the mist with their prisoner. Holmes lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly. A case built on images, Watson, not facts. Photographs posed to mislead. Silence arranged as truth. But in the end, what truly gave her away? I thought. Then said, the broken photograph, the one missing from the mantel. He nodded. Yes, because only someone who understood the power of memory would fear an image more than a witness. We returned to Baker Street before dawn, the lamp still glowing weakly through the heavy clouds. Holmes poured 2 glasses of brandy and settled into his chair with a sigh that did not quite conceal its weariness. I watched him for a moment before I asked, Do you think Evelyn will ever learn the full truth? Holmes turned toward the fire, eyes reflecting the flame. Only what she must. She need not carry the weight of every detail. Some truths, Watson, are not burdens, they are guardrails. She will learn to walk without falling into the shadows her family left behind. And Charles will stand trial, perhaps for conspiracy, but I suspect the court will find his guilt diluted. And Lydia? Holmes sipped once, then set the glass down. She chose clarity over chaos, a terrible kind of courage. He rose then, moved to the window, and stood there a long while, and in the flicker of lamplight and quiet rain, I saw what the photograph had never shown, the stillness behind the act, the sorrow behind the silence, the humanity behind the lie. The next morning broke with a sky the color of wet slate, and the streets of Baker Street glistened with the residue of overnight rain. The fog had thinned, but something heavier hung over us still. Not the mist of weather, but the weight of a case that, though concluded in form, had left a residue of unanswered questions in the mind. Holmes had slept little. I found him at his violin, drawing long, uncertain notes in the air like a man tracing outlines he could no longer see. The music was aimless, not melancholy, but unresolved. I watched in silence until he lowered the bow. The final truth still eludes me, he said without turning. It is not the mystery, Watson. That has been solved. It is the reason. I set down my newspaper. You doubt Lydia's account? He turned slowly, his gaze distant. I believe she told the truth, her truth. But I also believe that truth was chosen with care, like the way one selects a photograph to display and hides the rest. You think there's more? I know there is. He crossed to the desk and pulled from the drawer the daguerreotype we'd recovered in her lodging, the image of young Charles standing with Isabel Belham, the woman presumed to be his grandmother, but more likely his mother. Holmes studied it again, as if the grainy smile of the boy might blink or speak. I've been thinking about that occasion which Charles mentioned. Sutcliffe said, You're not the first mistake I've tried to forget. I nodded. It seemed like the wound that made everything bleed. Holmes tapped the edge of the photograph with his fingernail. What if it wasn't all cruelty? What if this was an admission? Charles has a predecessor, another child. Another secret. I leaned forwards. You think there was another heir? Or an affair? Or a long-buried betrayal? He arose abruptly. Come. We're not done with Sutcliffe's house. The Sutcliffe townhouse had returned to silence. The front door was now locked under police seal, but Lestrade, ever practical, had granted Holmes special access to the premises in case more evidence presented itself. The constable on duty recognized us and allowed us to enter without protest. The house had the cold, airless atmosphere of abandonment. Holmes moved with determination past the study and up the main staircase, not pausing until he reached the master bedroom door. He paused for a moment, not out of hesitation but out of instinct, before pushing it open. It was a gentleman's quarters in every way, well appointed but devoid of warmth. The wardrobe was now half emptied, with police tagging the drawers and leaving them ajar. But Holmes was not interested in clothing. He crossed instead to the bookshelf that lined the far wall. Hundreds of titles, from finance to poetry, meticulously arranged. Find anything? I asked. He did not respond immediately. Then, pulling a slim volume from the center row, The Life of Marcus Aurelius, he turned it in his hands. Something rustled within. A folded sheet, yellowed with age, tucked behind the back cover. He opened it carefully. It was a letter, unsigned, undated, but the penmanship matched Sutcliffe's. The ink was faded but legible. You know I cannot claim her. You know the shame it would bring. She will live as her mother did, discreetly and away from my affairs. I have made arrangements, but I will not speak her name again. Let this be enough. Holmes looked up slowly. This wasn't about Charles, I said. No, it was about someone before him, a daughter perhaps, hidden even from Lydia. Then Sutcliffe had 2 illegitimate children, possibly more. But this one, he took steps to erase entirely. She would be older than Charles. Born, I would wager, before Sutcliffe had any interest in becoming respectable. I felt the shape of something forming, like a negative revealing itself slowly in the bath of developer. Do you think Lydia knew? Holmes's gaze narrowed. She claimed that Sutcliffe rejected Charles, that she acted because her son was erased. But what if it wasn't rejection that broke her? You think she found this letter? I think, Holmes said quietly, that in the last months of Sutcliffe's life he feared being exposed, not for what he had done to Lydia, but for something older, something deeper, a child abandoned, a family lie too costly to resurrect. He folded the letter and placed it in his coat. We must speak to Evelyn, he said. She received us at Mrs. Littleton's drawing room, where she had remained since her uncle's death. She wore black still, but less from obligation now than from a quiet sense of continuity, as if her life had not resumed but simply paused. Miss Sutcliffe, Holmes began, what do you know of your uncle's past? His life before you came to live with him? She frowned. Very little. He never spoke of his younger years. My mother, his sister, died young. I remember being brought to London from Bath. That's all. Why? Do you know a name, Isabel Belham? Evelyn's eyes widened. That name was in one of my school letters. An old woman. She sent Christmas cards to the house until I was 12, and then they stopped. I once asked who she was, and he said she was no one I needed to know. Holmes nodded. Did your uncle ever mention having other relatives? Children? Never. He was guarded. Did he ever seem afraid? She hesitated. Once a year ago, a woman came to the house. I answered the door. She asked for him by name, but when I went to get him, he was gone from the study. I found him upstairs in his bedroom pacing. He told me never to open the door to strangers again. Do you remember what she looked like? She was old. Black hair, a strong face. Her accent was northern, perhaps. But she carried a note with her. I noticed it briefly. It had a name inscribed in red ink. Anna. Holmes breathed slowly. Thank you. When we returned to Baker Street, he went straight to his files, opening a thin drawer labeled Unresolved Inheritances, 1880s. After a few minutes, he produced a scrap of legal correspondence between a firm in Yorkshire and a solicitor in London. It referred to Anna Bell, who was born in 1866. Mother died. The father's name is recorded as unknown, although the estate is being disputed by a guy named Belham. Holmes stared at it intently. The sister of Lydia, he mumbled. The first daughter, hidden not out of shame but for strategic reasons. Sutcliffe first paid off the mother before paying to have the child erased. Lydia knew, but waited until Evelyn's inheritance proved that history had not only forgotten her, but also spat her out. He slid into the chair by the fire, his eyes shining with the terrible clarity of final comprehension. It was not vengeance, Watson. It was a restoration. Lydia Bellamy thought she was setting the record straight. The truth she uncovered did not involve murder. It was about legacy. She photographed the crime and framed it, so no one could deny it anymore. We sat in silence for a long time afterward. Holmes said almost to himself, "In the end, the past always evolves. Exposure finds it no matter how deep it is in the shadows." Just like film. The discovery of Annabelle's name brought no resolution, but rather a subtle disturbance in the waters Holmes had recently calmed. Though the main characters, Lydia, Charles, and Sutcliffe himself, had all been placed within the framework of motive and action, Anna's presence hinted at a deeper undercurrent that neither confession nor photograph had yet touched. The following morning, Holmes hunched over our growing pile of correspondence, legal scraps and family records, his long fingers tracing the margins like a man looking for margins within margins. Finally, he stood and spoke, not triumphantly but with quiet gravity. "We must go to Yorkshire." I looked up from my seat near the hearth. "Annabelle?" She was real. The estate records confirm her existence, as does the contested inheritance. But there's more, Watson. The solicitor who handled her early affairs, the one whose name appears on the correspondence Lydia preserved, died in 1889. His papers were passed to a junior partner, and it is his signature I recognize from another case entirely. My brows lifted. "You believe he knew Sutcliffe?" "I believe," Holmes said, "that the web is tighter than it seems. Sutcliffe wasn't merely avoiding scandal. He was insulating himself against a claim he knew would one day come knocking." We arrived in the village of Marshdown the following evening, a bleak hamlet ringed by moorland and grey as the sky. The wind was sharp, constant, and the local innkeeper regarded us with the thinly veiled suspicion reserved for men who ask too many questions and carry London habits in their boots. Holmes inquired after the Bell family without ceremony, and the name drew immediate response. "Anna?" the innkeeper said, lowering his voice as if the walls themselves might listen. I knew her. Strange girl. Kept to herself. Died some years back, 3 or 4. Took ill, never recovered. Did she have children? Holmes asked. The innkeeper nodded slowly. "A boy Samuel," Biddard himself. "Left town last year. Said he was going south. London, maybe. Or further." We exchanged a look. Another branch. Another leaf fallen from the same family tree. And her mother. Holmes continued. "Do you recall her name?" "Marjorie Bell. Worked as a dressmaker before she passed. Never married. Raised Anna alone. Folks said she had a patron once, some gentleman from the city who paid her bills and then vanished." Holmes's jaw tightened. "And Samuel, did he keep company with anyone here? Leave any trace?" "Not much. Lived quiet. Painted sometimes. I think he worked odd jobs. Left most of his things behind when he went." The innkeeper offered directions to the cottage Anna had kept near the edge of town. We walked there as night fell, the moors whispering with wind and damp. The house was shuttered, padlocked and hollow-looking. Holmes produced a small tool from his coat and unlatched the door as discreetly as if he'd been invited. Inside, the air was heavy with disuse. The furniture was minimal and covered in dust, but on the walls, hung with care, were a dozen paintings of the same subject. A woman with dark hair, severe eyes and a familiar jawline. Some depicted her sitting in a chair. Others are weeping. One, strangely, showed her standing beside a grave. "Marjorie Bell," I said, moving forward. Holmes surveyed the paintings with a look that I'd come to recognize as wariness rather than wonder. "No," he replied softly. "These weren't painted by Anna. Look at the brushwork, it's looser and more practiced. These were Samuel's." He reached into a box in the corner and pulled out a sketchbook. Flipping through it, he nodded once. "Watson, come here." I moved to his side. The open page included a charcoal drawing of Evelyn Sutcliffe. Not exactly. Her features were softened, her youth highlighted, but it was undeniable. There is a name next to it. Elaine. "She was watching them," I murmured. "No," Holmes muttered. "She was studying them. Samuel painted what he witnessed, and I think he saw more than he was supposed to. He closed the book and tucked it under his arm. "We need to return to London. If Samuel Bell is there, he may hold the last piece of this portrait. One painted not with blood or accusation, but memory." We returned by morning train, cold and fatigued, but carrying with us the unmistakable scent of something vital, something real. Holmes made inquiries immediately, placing word through his network of street urchins and cabmen. It was one of the irregulars, a boy named Jack with soot-black fingers and a laugh too sharp for his years, who brought the answer. "Found a bloke who matches, sir. Lives round Camden Lock. Sells paintings in the market. Doesn't say much. Bit twitchy." We arrived at the Camden stalls late that afternoon. Rain trickled over the awnings, and the smell of coal smoke and frying oil clung to the air. We found Samuel Bell tucked beneath a patchwork umbrella, seated beside a crate of modest canvases. His coat was too large, his hair unkempt, and his hands, stained with pigment, trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette. He looked up at Holmes with narrowed eyes. "You're not buying," he said. "No," Holmes replied, "but I am listening." Samuel stared, then exhaled and muttered, "I figured you might come. You remember me?" "No, but I heard. About Lydia, about Charles. They said it was over. But it's not, is it?" Holmes stepped closer. "Tell me what you know." Samuel glanced around, then gestured to a seat beside him. "You want to know why she did it, why she shot him? She said he shot himself." Samuel gave a dry laugh. "Maybe he did, maybe not. Doesn't change the truth." Holmes sat, expression unreadable. "My mother never spoke his name," Samuel began. "But she kept his letters. They were cruel, legalistic, transactional, promises broken, payments halted. She died thinking she was trash in his eyes, that Anna was better off unknown." "And Anna?" I asked gently. "She tried to forget, but she couldn't. When she got sick, I found her journal, and I found the portrait she'd painted once, from memory, of him. Percival Sutcliffe." Samuel pulled a small envelope from his coat. Inside was a photograph, an old one, folded, creased. It showed a young man standing with a child in his arms, the backdrop unmistakably Marshdown. Holmes examined it, his eyes narrowed. "There's writing on the back," he murmured. "To my dearest Anna, when she is old enough to hate me less." I felt the cold settle deeper into my bones. "So it was true," I said. "Sutcliffe had a daughter, then erased her." Samuel nodded. "And Lydia knew. She found out after my mother died. She wrote me, asked to meet, said we shared a history." "Did you meet?" "Once. She was tired, angry, said she did not want the money. She wanted the name. For Charles, for Anna, for me. She stated that the world would only believe the truth if it was presented clearly, if it was visible." Holmes looked up slowly. "The photograph. The last one," Samuel announced. "The one that mattered. Death is arranged like a memory. A lie so convincing, it looked like justice." He stubbed out his cigarette and met Holmes's gaze. "You came here thinking the case was closed. But you're wrong. It's still developing." And for once, Holmes did not argue. The rain had started again by the time we left the Camden Market, the skies heavy with a persistent drizzle that blurred gaslight into halos and made the streets shimmer like wet ink. Holmes said nothing for the better part of the journey back to Baker Street. He held Samuel's photograph, creased, faded, stained at one edge, with the same reverence one might show a sacred text. His thumb traced the scrawl on the back over and over again, as if each stroke of ink could be retranslated, reinterpreted, understood anew. "To my dearest Anna, when she is old enough to hate me less," I read aloud softly in the flickering carriage light. That doesn't sound like a man who expected to be remembered kindly. Holmes nodded without looking up. "It is an apology disguised as foresight, Watson." He knew what he'd done, but he believed distance and time would do what character could not, forgive him. And it didn't. No, because he left no bridge back, only silence. And in that silence, 3 generations built versions of the truth. Anna, Lydia, Charles, and now Samuel. He fell quiet again, gazing into the window, where the outline of London drifted past in smoky silhouettes. The city was still bustling at the edges, unaware of the storm that had gathered and passed among its narrow veins. I leaned back and closed my eyes, my thoughts swirling with questions that felt like they had no place in courtrooms, questions of inheritance, not of wealth, but of identity, of erasure, of name. When we reached Baker Street, the lamps were burning low, and Mrs. Hudson had already retired. Holmes sat immediately at his desk, spreading the photograph and letters before him in precise, almost reverent rows. He did not speak again until the clock on the mantel struck 3. "Watson," he said without turning, "do you recall the coroner's report?" "Of course." "Percival Sutcliffe, shot through the chest. Powder burns indicated close range. Time of death estimated between 10 and 10:30. Holmes tapped the report with a long finger. "And do you remember the location of the wound?" "Left side of the chest. Just below the heart. Precisely." "Now recall the angle." I blinked. "It was downward. The bullet entered from above. And Sutcliffe was seated. I saw it then. Too late." Holmes had already turned toward me with that particular gleam in his eye that meant his mind had clicked into place before mine even reached the edge. "He was seated," I said slowly. "But the shot came from above." Holmes nodded. "An impossibility, unless the man firing stood behind or above him." "But Lydia said he shot himself, that he raised the pistol and—" She lied. I stood, heartbeat quickening. "You're certain?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. He turned the photograph over again, this time placing it beside Bellamy's staged image. "Look here," he said. "In the real photograph, the one taken moments after death, Sutcliffe's posture is unnatural, yes. But more importantly, the blood pool spreads forward, not down. You're saying he was already slumped when she moved him?" "He was slumped because he was shot from behind while seated, and the bullet passed through the left side, meaning the shooter was not directly behind him, but at an angle." "But who? Someone taller, someone dominant in that moment, someone he was not expecting to pull the trigger." I stared at Holmes. "Charles." "No," Holmes said quietly. "Not Charles. He left." Bellamy confirms the door closed behind him. "And Lydia was still in the corridor. Then who?" Holmes did not respond, but his gaze went slowly to the last item on the desk, Samuel's sketchbook. "No," I replied. "You can't believe—" "I don't believe anything yet," Holmes remarked, "but I cannot ignore what is missing." I crossed the room and reopened the sketchbook, portrait after portrait, done in the same spooky, precise style. Evelyn, Lydia, Sutcliffe, but not one featuring Charles. Samuel never painted him. Holmes nodded. Because he had never seen him. Or he did, but couldn't bring himself to draw the man he killed. The words chilled me. They hung in the air too thickly and too abruptly. I sank into the chair. "But why?" I asked. "Why would Samuel shoot Sutcliffe?" He barely knew him. Holmes's tone was even. Because the photograph was not created from nothing. Lydia did not commission a falsehood. She intended it to be a record. And Samuel, seeing his family's pain repeated in paint, may have concluded that silence would never correct the record. Only a final frame, and picture of justice etched in blood rather than ink, could bring the drama to a close. But then why let Lydia take the blame? "Because he knew she'd accept it," Holmes explained. "She believed she was protecting Charles. Samuel believed he was protecting her. They were all shielding each other from a truth that was too fragile to say aloud." I rose slowly. "Then what do we do now?" Holmes looked out the window. The first strands of morning light were just starting to pale the sky, brushing against the edge of the curtain with hesitant clarity. "We speak to Evelyn." It was midday when we called her again. She greeted us in the drawing room of Mrs. Littleton's home, her face drawn but composed, the grief now sitting behind her eyes, like something carefully folded. "There's more, isn't there?" she said, before either of us spoke. Holmes tilted his head. "We believe so." He laid the two photographs before her side by side. One of her uncle slumped lifelessly in the study, the other, Samuel's, of Sutcliffe cradling a child. She said nothing for a long time. "I know he wasn't kind," she whispered. "But I didn't know he was cruel." Holmes studied her. "Do you recall ever meeting a young man named Samuel Bell? Quiet, artistic, often sketching near Camden?" She blinked. "I've seen him, once or twice. but I never knew his name." "He's your cousin," Holmes said gently, "the grandson of your grandfather's forgotten daughter, and the man who, we now believe, ended your uncle's life." She flinched slightly but did not cry. "He killed him." Holmes was careful. "We believe the final shot did not come from your uncle's own hand." Lydia arranged the scene. Bellamy followed instructions. Charles left. But Samuel saw the whole story and believed it required an ending. Evelyn's lips parted as if to protest, but she said nothing. Then slowly she nodded. "He told it with silence," she said. "Like the rest of them." She looked at Holmes. "Will he be arrested?" "I don't know," Holmes said. "The case officially has already closed on Lydia's confession. To reopen it would expose every secret you've only just begun to understand. And what do you think I should do?" Holmes's gaze was level. "You're the only one left in the house now. The decision is yours." She looked down at the photographs. Then, without speaking, she folded them together and placed them in her lap. "I'll keep them," she said, "not for punishment, for remembrance." And in that moment, something that had begun with a camera, with a lie frozen in glass, finally shifted into stillness, not resolved perhaps, but developed, as Holmes had said, a final image exposed at last. It was some days later, with the events of the case behind us and the fog once more retreating from the city's shoulders, that I found Holmes seated quietly by the fire at Baker Street, a rare expression of repose softening the angular lines of his face. The photograph Samuel had given us lay beside him on the table, alongside his pipe and an untouched cup of tea. He was not reading nor meditating in his usual intense silence. He was simply being, which, in Holmes's case, was always the rarest mood. I sat across from him, unable to shake the case's lingering gravity, the fractured lineage, the staged death, the hidden truths fighting their way to the surface via ash and silver nitrate. There had been no ultimate arrest and no dramatic trial. Lydia Bellam remained in custody, and her statement was recorded. Charles had been discreetly released, with his cooperation attributed to ignorance and filial duty rather than malicious intent. Samuel Bell had disappeared. "Do you believe he fled?" I inquired calmly, staring at the cold tea. Holmes shakes his head. "I believe he retreated to the only thing that ever brought him peace, anonymity. You can't arrest a ghost, Watson. Nor should you strive when the harm has already perpetrated by others' silence. Still," I continued, "he shot a man." Holmes lifted his sight to meet mine. "He shot an idea," I frowned. "Explain." Holmes leaned forward, his fingers steepled. "Percival Sutcliffe was not killed for money, passion, or revenge in the normal sense. He was killed because he had become the final custodian of a falsehood, one that stretched through generations, from Marjorie Bell's hushed life to Anna's erasure, to Lydia's slavery and Charles's indignity. Samuel, alone, artistic and invisible, absorbed all of that sorrow and, in one desperate move, attempted to destroy the architecture of erasure with a single bullet." I nodded slowly. "But you let him go," Holmes exhaled. "No, I let the truth go. The law already had a scapegoat. Lydia was willing to bear the load not because she was guilty, but because she knew something that neither courts nor media can. Justice is often the appearance of order, not its actuality." He stood and approached the window. Outside, the city rolled on as usual. Carriages clattered, youngsters cried out headlines, and chimneys sighed their soot into the air. Holmes observed it all with the detached gaze of a man who had peered too long into the photographic negative of a world that others chose to perceive in a cozy light. "And Evelyn?" I inquired after a moment. "Will she be all right?" "She will," he answered. "She possesses the will both literally and metaphorically. She has the truth even if it is incomplete, and strangely enough, she has the last family standing. Do you think she'll find Samuel again?" Holmes glanced away from the window, a tiny hint of a smile on his lips. "If he allows himself to be found." We went silent, each engaged in the unspoken epilogue. The photograph remained on the table, its edges curling slightly in the glow of the fire. Holmes picked it up again and saw it as human memory, faulty and warped. "You see," he explained, "in the end this case was not about who committed the crime. It was about who wrote the untruth. And that, Watson, is sometimes the more difficult reality to unearth." I carefully closed my notepad, the final line developing in my mind as the ash dropped on the hearth. "And it is the harder truth to live with." He nodded once, and then, with the final click of the photograph's case closing, the situation was resolved, not because the tale was finished, but because the story had finally ceased hiding.